Welcome to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk into a Bar,
the podcast where we mix a sometimes weird but always delicious cocktail of theology, philosophy, and spirituality. Well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to have a couple special guests on the podcast today. We'll be talking with the Reverend Canon Dr. Scot McKnight, which I just think is the coolest title ever. I don't know what it means, but it sounds really cool to me. And his daughter, Laura Barringer, who have authored a book together recently called A Church Called Tov. It's really good, really interesting. I should say at the beginning that this book contains some heavy themes, and our conversation about it also contains some heavy themes. We discuss things like sexual abuse, and so if that's a problem for you or if you have young children, we wouldn't recommend this episode for them. But for everyone else, this episode is an important one, and I think if you're a pastor, if you've ever considered being a pastor, or if you're a parishioner at a large church, especially,
mandatory.
This is definitely an episode that you should listen to.
Yep. Well, Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer, thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're super excited to have you.
Thank you for having us. It's really nice to be with you.
Good to be with you, yeah.
Excellent. For our listeners who might not know who you are and know what world you orbit in and all that business.
What?
Yeah, I know. That'd be crazy. But could you, just in case for those four people, let us know who you are?
All right, I am Scot McKnight, and I am a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary in Lisle, Illinois, which is pretty much a western suburb. I'm an author, and I've been teaching for almost 40 years.
Amazing.
I am Scott's daughter. I am Laura, and talking about world that you orbit in, I am a teacher. So this path is an unlikely one for me, that I'm sitting in this chair talking about abuse in the church. But I am the co-author of A Church Called Tov with my father, Scot McKnight.
So we're going to be talking today about the book that Scott and Laura just wrote called A Church Called Tov. Tov is a really, really fun word that I've had some fun with in the past as well. And Scott, you took it and made it into a name on this book. And you both just really, really took this concept of Tov, this ancient Hebrew word, and really turned it into something that I think a lot of churches need to pay attention to. So can you just first of all tell us what in the world is this three-letter word?
All right, when I wrote I think it was the first blog post about Willow Creek, I dropped the statement in the blog post that the church needs goodness. We need more goodness culture. And I knew that the Hebrew word behind goodness is tov. But I had so many people ask me questions about that word. Why did I use goodness? Where can we learn more about goodness? Why is goodness important? So I decided to do a little bit of a study. This was independent of writing the book, on the meaning of Tov in the Old Testament. And I got to tell you, I did not realize how pervasive this term is in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and how significant it is. And the expression that I use for it now is that it is a master moral category. It summarizes who God is, what God is like, what God has made, what God has designed, and what he wants of his people in this world. He wants them to be Tov.
So good.
So Tov.
So Tov, yes. Yeah, you got into my head a little bit. I found myself saying Tov every once in a while. So much of this book is formed and shaped, or seems to be formed and shaped by what happened at Willow Creek Community Church with Bill Hybels, the senior pastor there, and your experience as church members there, what it seems like. So would you guys both mind sharing about your experience prior to a little bit, but particularly as the allegations came out and they kept coming, and how the elders responded, and as the whole church is in crisis, just bring us into the emotions and what's going through your mind and what your conversations were like. Just bring us into that world a little bit.
Well, the story started for us. So the story broke on, I believe it was March 23rd, 2018. And I was sitting at a Mexican restaurant down the street with my husband. We can both remember exactly where we were when the story broke for us. We had been We were not attending Willow Creek at that point. We had left about a year prior, but we had met at Willow Creek, attended there for about 20 years, and always respected Bill's leadership. Now, admittedly, I never really knew Bill. I met him one time. I stood in line to meet him, but we always respected him as a leader and as a pastor. And so we read the headline, these allegations against Bill Hybels, and we were both like, oh, brother, here we go again. We just kind of shrugged it off, didn't believe it. Got in the car, we're driving home, and I started reading the article out loud to my husband, and we both looked at each other, and it was alarming because we knew the names of the people. We know the women, and we also knew the names of Betty Schmidt, for example, was an elder who was supporting the women. John and Nancy Ortberg, Jimmy and Leanne Miato. These were not people they're people of character and integrity. And so we right away were dealing with this tension between the churches saying that the allegations are false, but this group of people that we know to be people of integrity and character are saying that it's true. And somebody's not telling the truth, and either way, it's very disturbing. Well, we called my dad as soon as we got home, and that's really when the story started to unfold for us, as Mark and I were still not sure what to believe. And my dad told us that night that he'd seen this hundreds of times. It's a pattern that churches followed. He really hoped it wasn't true, but the likelihood that all of these people were lying was very low.
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, we loved Willow Creek. Chris and I attended for 10 years, and we liked a lot of the ministries. There were so many things going on that was good. But I'm a seminary professor, and a lot of my students are pastors. And those who aren't pastors, most of them are very involved in churches. Bill Hybels is one of the most influential pastors in the world. Mm-hmm. And I felt betrayed because this is a man that I had praised. I had told my students he was a good man. I felt betrayed because this is a church that people use as a paradigm and a model. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, okay, this is what's happened. This is going to become a story told in seminaries for the rest of my life, not by me, but this will become a test case, a hypothetical case in seminary classrooms of what happens, why it happens when pastors fall like this, and we discover that behind the curtains there were things going on that should never have been happening for a pastor.
The other thing that was so hard to wrap our minds around was it wasn't just the pastor. I mean, that was hard enough to grapple with, but it was this whole system. It was like peeling back the layers of an onion, and just betrayal is a good word, feeling betrayed by people that we had thought were, I mean, not that I don't believe that they're Christians, but these were people that we thought were living in truth, and to see and hear what they had been doing to people, it was very disorienting.
Man, yeah. We're 90 miles north of you guys. You're in Chicago area, we're in Milwaukee area. And I remember where I was when I read about it, because like you said, Scott, Bill Hybels is a legend, highly respected. And I just remember having the same thoughts as you guys, just I didn't know anybody personally. But in your first chapter of this book, you guys talk a lot about culture and a church culture, and that churches have cultures, whether or not pastors, church leaders, or even congregations know it. You've got a culture that's been built in. Can you explain that a little bit, this idea that a church has a culture, and what might that culture look like, and who's shaping that culture, and how intentional we might be? I think this is a really important point that not enough people get in the church.
Yeah, and this was a big part of our conversation between Laura and me, well, but also Mark and my wife, Chris. We had this conversation a lot, and I kept saying it's a culture. Mm-hmm. It is extraordinarily rare that a pastor can get by with what Bill Hybels or James McDonald or C.J. Mahaney or the Southern Baptist pastors that were disgraced in the Houston Chronicle. We could go on. Mm-hmm. Roman Catholic priests in the Curia of the Vatican. Those things don't happen normally on their own in an isolated fashion. there is some kind of culture that encourages and permits and legitimates and justifies and protects so that this goes on. David Brooks, in a book I read of his called The Second Mountain, said something that just stunned me when I read it. So I say it everywhere I go now. Never underestimate the significance of the environment in which you work. I'm summarizing now. To make you the kind of person that works in that environment with comfort. This is vital. And in studying New Testament studies, there's a wonderful guy named Matthew Krausman who wrote a book on a technical PhD on Romans, in which he argued that cultures develop in this way, that there are behaviors at the bottom. Let's just say everybody's behaving a certain way. This keeps going to the point that it becomes an agent. It becomes an active agent, not a person, but almost personified. So that Saddleback Church is an agent. North Point Community Church with Andy Stanley is an agent. Willow Creek is an agent. Elmbrook Church in Milwaukee is an agent. And you experience it, and it impacts people in a sense. So we impact it to create the culture. The culture then comes back to work upon us and influences us to be the kind of person that works in that culture. If you don't like that culture and you fight it, you will be eliminated. If you stay, you will become like that culture. And I believe that churches, every church is a culture, and we need to become discerners of our own church's culture so that we can see what is shaping us. And it's, we like to think it's just the Bible or it's just God and me. And we're being shaped in so many ways. Everybody who talks today about spiritual formation talks about the significance of community and group forming us into the agents or the people that we are. And a church is a culture, and we need to be aware of that. We participate in it. The leaders participate in it, impacting the people. The people then influence the leaders. The leaders then allow the church, or the church allows the culture to become an agent that begins to make us all fit into this church culture in such a way that we behave in a way that's approving to that culture.
Yeah. I want to ask you here about the interplay between the culture and individual character or individual intention, because you say it really strongly in the book. Early in the book, you put it this way. You say, a rooted culture is almost irresistible, and you italicize irresistible. And then you say, if the reinforcing culture is toxic, it becomes systemically corrupted and corrupts the people within it. So how much room is there here for individual character and individual choice? Because I think we'd all like to think to ourselves, if I had been at Willow Creek or if I had been wherever and I had seen that kind of thing, I would have resisted. I would have done something different. But it seems like you're saying we're fooling ourselves. Is that right?
Well, Kyle, this is a good question. I do believe that humans have individual agency. So yes, we can resist a culture, but if you are in a strong culture, now I'm starting to talk the language of the cultural anthropologist. If you are in a strong culture, you will be worn down by resistance because it's too powerful to resist. And I've had people from some of these churches that we're talking about, not just Willow Creek, say the culture was so powerful that I could do nothing about it. I spoke up. I tried to resist. It was impossible. Now, those people all were witnesses to the fact that they weren't corrupted by that culture. So we can avoid the corruption. That's a little bit different, and it's possible, from those who try to resist the culture and change it. There are many people, Kyle, who just float along and bob along in their inner tubes on the culture and are not recognizing it, aren't resisting it, aren't affirming it, but they're just part of the culture and they don't know it. And increasingly in mega churches, there's just way too many people who are just participants in that way. They just watch, they're observers.
Yeah. Do you think that's endemic to the megachurch system itself?
The smaller the church, the less you can be simply an observer. The bigger the church, the more likelihood of the presence of observers. Now, what I mean by an observer is someone who just comes, watches church, and goes home without being responsible, without being called on the spot, without asking to do anything. They just come and watch. It's the way I go to a Milwaukee's Brewers game. I'm just a watcher, unless they're playing the Cubs. And then, right now, I'm not too happy about the Cubs.
I did notice, Laura, you did pop in a Go Cubs in there, and had to just let you know I still love you. I know you're a Cubs fan.
Go Cubs.
We can edit that out. Don't worry.
Yeah. Good. Laura, you said you spent 20 years at Willow Creek. That's a lot of your adult life, I'm assuming. You spent, and now you're at, it sounds like more of a high church, probably smaller church. Can you describe those church cultures? And did you even know it? Would you have known this 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, this culture at Willow Creek?
No, and that's an interesting question. You guys were just talking about the observer. I think that in large part was me. I guess I was more than an observer because I was involved in the section ministry and had close community at Willow Creek, but it took being removed from that church and that culture to be able to see the toxicity of it. So here's one example. When I started going to an Anglican church, I noticed right away there's no production. There's no screen. It's not about a person who's coming up on stage to talk. There's no standing up and cheering and clapping for people. And I did not see, I can honestly say when I was at Willow Creek, I did not see it. I was just part of it. Everyone stood and clapped, so I stood and clapped. And I have to own my part in perpetuating the celebrity culture that existed there. And I believe personally from my experience that it can be really hard to see when you're in it. And I'm thankful that I left it and so that I'm able to see what the toxicity was, but I didn't see it at the time.
And I don't think most people do recognize their culture. You know, I don't know the name of the author, but it's a clever title. It's The Color of Water. There's a culture in a church. And I think you have to have analytical tools that you learn by way of theory and education, someone helping you see, so that you can detect a culture in any group, in any church. And Chris, my wife, is a psychologist, and she has helped me see over the years the culture of institutions. I've taught in 3 major institutions. And I've been able, the first one was particularly, I taught at Trinity, was particularly difficult to discern because I was so young and just trying to survive, you know. But then when I went to North Park, I began to recognize a different kind of culture. And at Northern, we have a different culture. But you have to have some tools, you have to have some equipment, you have to have some learning and experience to recognize cultures. Otherwise, you'll just believe whatever is said from the platform about what's actually going on. You just think, well, that's what the pastor says, that's what is.
Scott, if it's okay, I'd like to dig into some Bible verses a little bit. So you talk about in chapter 3 several verses that are often used by ministers who are accused of wrongdoing as kind of procedural defenses, not defenses of their behavior, but defenses against bringing up their behavior. So this is particularly passages in Matthew 18, 1 Timothy 5, 1 Corinthians 6 that you talk about. And you say that the way they get used is profoundly unbiblical. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Okay, let me start with one that I think is pretty easy. In 1 Timothy, it tells us that no one is to lay a charge or make an allegation against an elder apart from 2 or 3 witnesses. All right, now that is an interesting verse, and I've heard it used. It was used at Willow Creek of why the women should not be making accusations against Bill Hybels. Mm-hmm. Well, here is a reality, Kyle. Most men who abuse women sexually don't do it in public. I think the chances are less than 1%. I mean, unless it's on video and that they didn't realize it was on video. They do these things privately, which means you could never, a woman could never lay an allegation against a pastor, an elder, a bishop, whatever you want to call them, unless someone else was there and saw it. Matthew 18 is used that if you have an offense against someone, you should go to that person privately. If they don't respond, you go to 2 or 3, you bring 2 or 3 witnesses. And if that doesn't happen, you go to the whole church. That seems like an orderly process for offenses. But what if it is a teenage girl raped by a leader in a church? Is she to go to that person privately and to try to redress the situation? This is profoundly foolish, re-traumatizing, re-victimizing of the woman. So those verses are important, but they have to be taken in context. I called Willow Creek on the spot on my blog and said, let's go to Deuteronomy, where a woman was sexually abused, raped perhaps, that's what it sounds like, out in a field where no one saw it. And it's amazing. The Jewish law, I checked this with 2 different Old Testament scholars, and I said the law seems to suggest that the woman's voice was going to be believed and trusted over the man's. And the Old Testament scholar said, absolutely, that's exactly what it's saying. So that would mean that Matthew 18, 1 Timothy, 1 Corinthians 6 is you're not to go to the public authorities. You're supposed to stay inside the church. Churches have proven they have no idea how to handle sexual abuse cases, how to investigate. So this is outside their parameters. And it just drives me to say we have to listen to different verses for the context that they're bringing out, the assumptions, and learn to use the proper text. And I think in this case, Deuteronomy was the text that was most like the situations at Willow Creek. I've got plenty of stories of these private type things too. So what I'm saying about Willow Creek there applies to about 500 churches in the United States in the last 10 years.
Yeah. And you guys obviously made a choice to include people's names, to name institutions where abuse has happened, where cover-up has happened, where even, I'm thinking of the Village Church in Houston, I think it is, Matt Chandler's church, where you show this example of a membership covenant where they basically in a legally binding fashion, don't allow anybody to bring any lawsuit against them for anything. It blew me away. But you guys obviously made a choice to name names, and I'm really grateful you did, but I'm sure that didn't come lightly, that decision, and you talked about that and collaborated. Tell us about why you decided to name so many names, name so many institutions in real time.
It's important to the victims that the names are named. It's important to them that their stories are heard. And it really was never a question for my dad and me. It was just something that I felt was the right thing to do. I'm sure some others disagree, but it wasn't a decision we made necessarily for us, but it was for those who have been victims of abuse so that their stories are the ones that are told now.
Okay, yeah, this is critical on this one is that the victims, when you minimize and diminish names and protect it under some abstraction, the victims feel like they're protecting the perpetrators. So that's an important thing. And it's something that, frankly, the male white culture of churches doesn't have an instinct for. So if you ask the women, should we have named the names? every one of them to a person said yes. Interesting. Okay. First of all, I would also say the stories that we tell in the book are public information. We are not doing an expose of information that nobody knows about. Now, look, we probably told some stories that we probably told a lot of stories that most people didn't know anything about. But it's not because we dug up stories as investigative journalists. It's because they didn't know about these stories. Okay, we did tell the story of one young woman at Willow Creek who hadn't told her story in public like this before. But she cleared it with us and with lawyers. The second thing is it's real. This is the reality. These are names. It also makes the stories credible. If I say a pastor in the Midwest abused what may have been a person in his church, and that's where I leave it, you go, okay, what does that mean? If I say James McDonald cussed out so-and-so and give the name, you go, okay, this is real stuff. Now, this is what's interesting to me. I've had just one person tell me they didn't like that I use names. And I said, the precedent for using names is the Bible. Look at Abraham. You know, he gives his wife away a couple times. Stupid behavior. Look at Solomon. Look at David. Look at the whining of David in his prayers as well. Look at Peter. Peter gets hammered in the Gospels. He gets hammered by Paul in Antioch in Galatians chapter 2. Look at the book of Revelation, naming names. All right? So names are reality. We are real people with real names. And I think it gives it a graphic reality. The other side for me is I'm a professor. When I name names, my students, I'm also an author and now a podcaster. When I name names, I know that people say, he could someday name my name. Or they say, ooh, I don't want my name named like that. And it can exercise a moral exhortation to them to watch themselves. I'm not looking for people to name. But I believe that naming the names was neither divulging of things that weren't known before. These are stories that are out there. And at the same time, they're going to function as a way of warning people that they're real people and what they do could be known.
They love having their name out there when it comes to selling books and being the best preachers in the world, but not sure about this. Yeah, I'm with you.
That's the other side of it, and that's the truth, is that they love, a lot of these people love the glory, the glitz of being praised for their great accomplishments, but they despise having their name, being criticized. That's a good
Now, I know we're talking a lot about abuse. The book isn't just a book about abuse in the church, but that's really a big catalyst for it. And there was a shocking quote that you guys put in the chapter about Tov churches nurture justice. You talk about Rachel Denhollander a lot, who was abused by Larry Nassar at Michigan State and has gone on to become an advocate for abuse victims in really beautiful, potent ways. She's a believer as well. And she's quoted, you guys quoted her from Christianity Today in a 2018 interview where she said, church is one of the least safe places to acknowledge abuse, and church is one of the worst places to go for help. Now, I'm a church guy. I love the church. I've given my adult life to the church. I'm a Jesus guy. And that right there, coming from a Christian in particular, but that right there coming from an abuse victim is shocking. That the church is one of the least safe places to reveal abuse. The church is one of the worst places to go for help, when that's supposed to be our job. Elaborate on that. Like, is that as shocking to you as it is to me?
It's part of the reason why we felt called to write the book that we did. There's too many instances of an abuse victim coming forward, and rather than being cared for and loved and healed, they are treated as if they just go into institution protection mode and they silence the victim, discredit the victim to save the reputation of the church. And that is exactly what happened to Rachel Den Hollander. Most people know her as the gymnast and who spoke out against Larry Nassar, but she also had a horrible experience trying to come forward as a victim of abuse in her church.
Yeah, and a church that is famous for its claims to be theologically rich and biblically obedient. But the simple obedience of empathy and grace and love and care for a victim, a wounded person, was violated by that church. And so I agree with what Laura said, is that, and what Rachel Den Hollander said, time and time again, we have encountered people who, when they came forward about something going on at church, were just pounded. Mm-hmm. It's just, well, think about it. If you are calling a leader, a pastor in a church, on the spot for a sin that violates, let's just say, his or her pledge, for a sin that impugns that person's character and reputation as a great Christian, then they have two possible responses. This is exactly what I told Lauren Mark on the first night. Willow has two options. It can either seek the truth, humble themselves before the truth, or they can come out swinging. And they came out swinging. And that is the common pattern, to defend themselves. How many of these pastors, and look, I told Lauren Mark, I said, if they come out defending themselves, there's going to be some more women who come forward. Mm-hmm. And then they might try to defend themselves again. Eventually, they're going to lose this argument. It's best to tell the truth. And this is the way institutions protect themselves. And it's sickening and it's hideous that we claim the gospel of truth, and then when confronted like this, that churches and leaders, they deny the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, telling the truth after the fact, after you've already tried to defend yourself, loses all power. I mean,
it really does.
Too late at that point.
Really does.
You say in the book that what the leadership of a church does first reveals its culture. And that seems so true. I'm reminded of Ravi Zacharias, who was in the news recently. He's dead now, but the ministry he left behind is still reeling from recent allegations.
Yes, and their responses were to come out, that this lady, Lori Ann Thompson, is lying. She's not telling the truth. And
signing NDAs, the whole thing. They went
one thing after another, and they've not done well on the. No. I mean, here's a ministry that defends the truth of the gospel. Yeah. That's what its goal is, to get people to admit the truth. And here, they've not done so well.
Dave Ramsey is another one.
I hadn't even heard about that.
Oh, boy. He got scorched in religious news service two or 3 weeks ago.
Can't say I'm surprised.
As I read the first half of your book, which is mainly about toxic cultures, how to identify toxic cultures, what makes a toxic culture in a church, and then you switch into the lovely space of how to cultivate a Tov culture. And when you start talking about Jesus in the Gospels, and you start quoting Jesus in the Gospels, the contrast to me between Jesus in the Gospels, that's Jesus that we say is our Messiah, our leader, the one we follow and give ourselves to, and you contrast that to, let's just say, church leaders. Let's just say church leaders. The way they act, the way they talk, the way they respond to people, the way they teach even, and the whole thing. The difference couldn't be starker. I mean, it just blew me away that we have a bunch of people who say they believe in Jesus and preach Jesus, but they have no idea how to live like Jesus and how to lead like Jesus. And it also got me thinking, I bet if Jesus was around today, pastoring a church in America, I'll bet you any money he'd be seen as a failure as a pastor. Like, those methods don't work for growing a megachurch. Would you agree?
Well, you've used the right words for me. You've hit my triggers that I like to kind of pound the pulpit about. We measure too many churches by the word success, when the word success means how big of an audience we can gather on a Sunday morning. And I do not know where this came from. It's a distinctly American phenomenon. When churches in Europe were in dioceses, you went to your local church. The idea of getting a bigger church than everybody else, they would say, "You've got too many for your church. We're going to have to build another building." We now have this American phenomenon of trying to see how big of a church we can, and then we glorify the pastors who do this. Jesus measured, let's use the word success for him, and I call this the Jesus Creed. He measured it by people who learned to love God and love others as themselves. And so a genuinely formed person for Jesus is someone who loves God and loves others. We don't measure that. We don't have any attendance boards in our churches for the percentage of people who are loving versus the percentage of people who are creeps. We don't do that. We measure how much money came in. We measure how many seats were filled. We measure parking lots. We measure the size of the building and the budget. And we have surrendered the very core of what spiritual formation is supposed to be about in the pages of the Bible. Tov is never measured by numbers.
Yeah. Guys like me are the source of a lot of this problem. Senior pastor, lead pastor of a church, we just feel so good about ourselves as our church is growing and the budget's growing and how many baptisms we had this year. We love that stuff. But also, it's a church culture like you're talking about. It's the elder board or whoever is the core team who's leading. Just go, and if you don't believe me, just go and look at some lead pastor, senior pastor job descriptions and see what churches are looking for. Because it's all about the numbers. It's all about the accomplishments. It's all about what have you done for me lately in the church. I mean, you show that Willow Creek, they come out of having a narcissistic leader who lies and abuses people. And then they go and they kind of look for kind of the same traits. Not abuse. They don't ask for an abuser, but they want the big megastar to be leading their church. That's a culture problem that you still didn't learn after everything fell to the wayside. I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
We were really disappointed and then at the same time not surprised when Willow Creek's new job description came out. My dad actually in the book put it in a word cloud of Willow Creek's job description versus what the Bible looks for in a pastor. And it's very, shall we say, revealing of the difference between what Willow was looking for and what the Bible would say a pastor is. I mean, there were lines in there like somebody who's well connected and made it in life. And I thought, what are you doing? Have you not learned from the mistakes of the past? But like you said, just because Bill Hybels is gone doesn't mean the culture problem is gone as well. And it runs a lot deeper than I, for one, realized.
I have a friend who is, I think you could call him a pastor headhunter. I mean, he doesn't just do it for churches, but he does it for Christian institutions. And he read I posted the job description as a word cloud on my blog. And he read it and he wrote me a letter. And he admitted, he said, I'm frankly embarrassed by what we're doing in our business. Now, he wasn't connected to the job description written for Willow Creek, but he said, I'm embarrassed by what we're doing. And he said, I think I have good theological instincts and I need to work on this as to what I help churches think of what they need and to help them with terms and language that is more consistent with what pastors are called to do. So I'm hoping that the word clouds on matching pages in our book will have an impact on churches with the clear possibility that somebody is going to copy what I did with the job descriptions that they post for their churches and put it on the internet and everybody can see what they're looking for. But the Willow Creek job description to me was, as a seminary professor and as a Bible guy, it was just flat out embarrassing. They were looking for a successful entrepreneur. And I don't know what that means for a pastor.
And let's be honest, that's what most megachurches are looking for, if we're just totally honest. I mean, I want to ask the question, should megachurches exist at all? Like, I kind of want to say no, I don't think it's a very biblical model. It's not a historical model, like you pointed out, Scott. Should we just pull the plug on megachurches altogether?
As we were writing the book, before it went to production, we had a friend, Mike Bro, actually read it and gave us really good feedback that he felt that we were being a bit tough on megachurches. So we did soften it a bit, but the more that I read and researched about big churches and small churches, I personally have become, and maybe this is something I need to do my own soul work on, but I feel very suspicious of megachurches and their cultures. I'm very leery of them, and my dad has said this, and I believe the same, that it takes a person of extraordinary character to be able to pastor a megachurch and not fall into the temptation of celebrity and feeling more important than everybody else, and the power that comes with it, not absorbing that.
Well, Randy, you've asked a good question, and I think I've been asked this 25 times since the book has been written on podcasts. And I have the same answer, and I'm not wavering on it. No, I don't think the problem is megachurches. The early church bragged about the number of people who were converted, remember, and it was in the thousands. Mm-hmm. So they had a little bit of number consciousness there. But the key issue to me is the culture and the formation of the pastor and the leaders and what kind of culture that they're helping to form and how pastoral the church actually is. I can remember when we were attending Willow Creek. I have a little bit in my family, a little bit of paranoia about every pain I get, and I wondered if I was having heart problems. And I remember riding on the train in Chicago thinking, man, if I die, I mean, who would run the funeral?
I've never heard this story.
And I thought, this is an indictment of a church. Because Bill Hybels didn't know me from anybody. I think that I would measure a megachurch's pastoral giftedness by the percentage of people who are known by a pastor-type person in the congregation. Mm-hmm. So you may be in a small group and you have a leader. Let's say Kyle's your leader. His image is big on this screen right now. And he's the leader. I know that I can go to Kyle if we have a death in the family or a marriage or something, and I can go to him and say, can you help us with this? If I say, geez, I got to go stand in line with 200 other people to find out if there's somebody at the church who would help me with my family because my grandpa died, I think we're in trouble. So I want to know how pastorally networked the church is before I'm going to talk about numbers. I know there are small churches that while everybody's name is known, the pastor is just as authoritarian, and maybe that's all the bigger of a church he can get because he's such a pinhead, he lacks gifts and he just wants to be in charge of things. So I'm nervous about being too hard on mega churches, but what Laura said, something is very important to me. It takes enormous character, good Tov character, to handle that much glory. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've been on some of those platforms. I've spoken at Andy Stanley's church and Rick Warren's church and Bill Hybels' church. I've been on that platform. It's pretty cool. I mean, if you want to have influence, that's the platform, But it takes something. Mm-hmm. It takes something special.
Yeah. Laura, we've never had a father-daughter, guests on the show, and I know that there's a really good embarrassing story you could tell us about Dr. Scot McKnight that would, it would just be a gift to the world if it was out there, not just in your family.
Well, okay, I don't really have anything that about him, but he would embarrass me when we were growing up. Dad, do you remember? So our house is between the two high school campuses, okay? So as a freshman, I would have to walk back and forth between the freshman building and the main campus of the high school. And my dad would, as a high schooler, you're like very self-conscious of like, I don't know, your parents, whatever. So I would walk by and my dad would be in the window, like holding up signs. One time you were holding up a sign like, "Hi, Laura," or like standing in the window in like your shorts when it was super cold outside. So I remember him liking to embarrass me. Yeah. He also, we typically go somewhere warm every December, and my dad never, I think in one time I can remember him getting in the water.
Oh, really? What's
it would be like,
Scott?
We were just sitting there, and all of a sudden he was like, "I'm going to go in the water." And we were all like, what? And we all like jumped up and took pictures. Like,
Okay, now look, I'm a pretty good swimmer. I grew up swimming a lot. So it's not about water. It's that I don't have any reason to get cold and to get wet. When we go on warm places like that, I find a shade tree and a place that has a straight back chair and a place to put some books, and I sit there and I read. I have no interest in getting my books wet.
except for the 1 year when he's like, "I'm going to go in the water," and everybody jumped up and took pictures. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining us, guys. This has been really fun. Loved the book. It's super important. Everyone listening to this should buy it immediately. It should be, as Randy said, required reading for all new pastors, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I feel a little bad because we talked mostly about the negative stuff, but most of the book is about the good stuff, the positive stuff, how to build a good culture. So you'll just have to read it and find out.
We've been with a lot of interviews here, and this was a good one. You guys have read the book. You have something to say. And, I've been on radio stations where they obviously didn't even look at the book. They just had some canned questions. And what does Tov mean? And what's in the second part of your book? So this is, we appreciate it that you care. I think you're thoughtful, and I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, you guys were great.
Hopefully we can have you on again sometime soon, but bless you guys. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Well, it's super fun talking with Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer about A Church Called Tov, this really remarkable book. And I'd love to flesh it out a little bit more between the three of us, chat about it. But let's do that over a drink, shall we? Kyle, what are we drinking today?
Yeah, absolutely. Great idea. So what we've got today is a straight bourbon whiskey from a place in Nashville, Tennessee called Nelson's Green Brier Distillery. So they make a label called Belle Meade. I don't know if either of you have ever heard of this, but they've got several expressions now. The distillery is only about 7 years old or so. I think they started producing in 2014. But it's a restart of a much, much older distillery that went by the same name from the late 19th century. So apparently in the late 1800s, it was like one of the biggest bourbon producers in the country, and then Prohibition shut it down. And then the great grandsons of the original owners restarted it just a few years ago. And so they're now producing whiskey under the label Belle Meade. And they're making some really interesting stuff. I think just as of last year, they've started reproducing the original recipe of their great-great-great-grandfather, which was like a 4-year Tennessee whiskey or something. I haven't tried that one. But so there's some history to this, even though it's fairly recent. I've only had this, the straight bourbon. It comes in at 45.2%, and it's a high rye bourbon, like really high rye. It's about 30% rye, so really spicy. You have to like that rye flavor, but I find them really interesting.
So we were trying to do tasting shorter, and then Professor Whitaker decided to take us to school and give us an education about whatever this distillery's name is that I don't remember.
Don't ask me about whiskey if you don't want to hear about whiskey.
Let's taste this, shall we?
It's got a great nose, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You got a little bit of orange on the nose. Some
Yeah,
leather.
can you have a full-bodied nose? I was going to say that. It just...
It smells and tastes aged. It doesn't taste young at all. It doesn't have that new makey sweetness to it.
Yeah, no age statement. Obviously, you know it's at least 2 years old, but yeah, it doesn't taste new at all.
It is spicy. Like it brings that rye spice, but it's full-bodied. I love it's dark and you can taste it. It tastes like the barrel. I like it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a dry January and so far in February for me when we're recording this. So I don't know. I really like it. I don't know if it's because I haven't had anything recently or if it's actually that good, but it's just blowing me away. Fantastic.
Yeah, this is the first thing I've had to drink since my wisdom tooth surgery, which is several weeks ago. So hitting me in all the right places too.
Yeah, this is tasty.
They make some interesting cask finish stuff too. Like they have a sherry cask finish. They have a Madeira finish, maybe one other one too, which I've been looking out for but haven't found them just yet.
Thanks for the proper pour, Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I decided to give you 2 ounces this time. I'll try to do that again going forward.
It was generous.
Much appreciated.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
Belle Meade, straight bourbon. So, Randy, I wanted to ask you, this book is about church culture, and you're the pastor of a church that has a culture, and I think it's a very obvious culture and somewhat of a unique culture, and it's honestly one of the big reasons I decided to stay at Bruce City when I visited for the first time. And you've heard me say this before, but one of the things that convinced me to stick around was in my first few weeks there, I attended a business meeting, essentially, or what you guys call a family meeting, right? It's just still a little cheesy, but I'll let it slide. At this business meeting, you guys were talking about stuff I didn't care about, money and things going on in the leadership team. And there was some disagreement. I don't even remember what it was about, but I remember there was some rather serious disagreement amongst some people there. But it wasn't like any business meeting I'd ever attended at a church before. Because my experience at every church I'd attended before, one in particular that I had spent a long time at immediately before coming to Bruce City, like there was no room for disagreement with the head pastor. That was viewed as dissension or rebellion if it continued, right? And that's not at all what happened at this business meeting. There was honest, open disagreement, and then like compassionate consideration in response. And it really spoke to me pretty strongly about what I could expect from the people in this church, even after just a couple of weeks of being there. So you, I think, I don't know how much of it has to do with you specifically, but somehow Bruce City has been able to cultivate what seems to me a fairly unusual church culture. So I'm curious from your perspective as someone who I assume has taken pains to make a church culture that's really healthy. What was it like for you to read this book? And was there anything in particular that you thought maybe could be better about the culture that you've formed?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because people ask me every once in a while, would you ever write a book? Or if you would write a book, what would it be about? And Scott and Laura kind of stole the idea from me. I wouldn't have written A Church Called Tov, but I would write about how to form a church culture. Because I've talked to so many pastors, so many church leaders, and so many pastors' kids even, who kind of give me this knowing nod saying, you got a really crappy job, right? I mean, you got to listen to all the garbage, all the BS, all the mumbo jumbo, and people hate you, and they're there's infighting and all the stuff, and it became a pattern enough to where I was like, no, that's not my experience. We don't have that, and what I quickly realized was that I think too many pastors and church leaders don't realize that you can try to shape a culture, particularly if you have a leadership team with you, alongside you, that's committed to shaping a culture of goodness, like they're talking about, that's committed to shaping we talk about a culture of honor at our church. And so that's probably what you heard me say was, you can bring your questions, you can bring any question. Consider whether that's most appropriate in this venue or in a different venue. But here's what we are going to commit to one another to do. And that's to foster and build a culture of honor. where we're just honoring one another even when we disagree with one another. We tried to build a culture of family over and over again. And so that's probably why you picked up that like there's no questions, no tension, that's off limits, because that's what family does, and we're going to act like a family. So reading this book affirmed that for me so much, of how I think many times the book isn't about this, but many times a pastor or church leader or leadership team are kind of along for the ride of the culture of their church. They're trying to please the culture of their church. It's a culture of consumerism that they're trying to feed now, and they are just along for the ride. So that's a huge part of it. But as I read this book, the biggest thing that really affected me, that made me think and has made me think, I thought about it today a number of times, is this reality of the celebrity pastor and the narcissistic tendencies that people in my position can have. That honestly, it's hard not to have a narcissistic tendency for a person in my job, where you're talking up front every single week. You're giving yourself to a bunch of people, and that's vulnerable. And you either have to like be an attention slave and really just look for approval from everyone around you, or you just got to turn into a narcissist that doesn't care about what people think, because you know you're delivering the goods. And especially when you're making big decisions, there's just so much that goes into the job that lends itself to narcissistic tendencies. And that's what convicted me, is that I see that in myself a little bit. I know that when left to my own devices, I could definitely turn into a narcissist, and I would love this culture where everybody praises me all the time. When I was on sabbatical, just gone from the church for 3 months, I didn't expect that to be one of the most refreshing things for me as a person and for my soul, is not hearing every single week, great sermon. Oh, Randy, you nailed it this week. I like hearing that. That's a fun time to hear that affirmation. But I learned month and a half, 2 months into sabbatical, that's toxic for my soul in many ways. And so is the email that says the 4 points why what you said is theologically incorrect. That's not good for your soul either.
I apologize for that, Randy.
But yeah, I mean, that's what hit me between the eyes, is I have narcissistic tendencies, and I don't mind the celebrity church culture that easily happens. I mean, I was in an elder meeting last night where when I speak, I say things strongly, usually, and especially if I care about them a lot. Last night we were talking about something that I care a lot about, and I came through strong, and one of our elders said, "You can't make decisions just because you think that." And I was like, of course I can't. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying what I think. But I realize that I come off like that. And if I don't have strong people around me, like that amazing woman told me last night, who is an elder, I would easily turn into that guy who just steamrolls the room and everybody says yes to. And all of a sudden we've got a culture that just is a bunch of yes men.
Yeah. Yes, men specifically, right?
Yeah.
It seems to me like there's this constant cultivation that has to be there too, because as soon as you think you've dialed in on something that perhaps you look at the churches around you and you see, thank goodness it's not like that here, and we've intentionally made it different, and we've examined their mistakes and we've done something else, but then that self-righteousness starts to creep in, and it's the same thing that we rejected in the first place, or the way that much of the way that the message is conveyed at Brew City is because we have somebody in the senior pastor role who isn't really afraid of what people think. And if we had somebody who is afraid of what people think, then I don't think we would be in as healthy a spot. But then that, if that just strays a little bit too far out of range, then that's playing out in a way where, like you just laid out, it's unhealthy again. And so it seems like there's just this constant dialing, and the moment you try to leave it static and say, okay, we made it, you're headed the opposite direction again.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a fine line. And I think what Laura said about what Scott said, which was, in order to be a pastor a megachurch, in order to lead a megachurch, it takes an incredible amount of character. I mean, that's just it. It's such a fine line. And I don't pastor a megachurch. I mean, our church is 250, 300 people, but that's enough to make me really wonky really quickly if we get too high on the celebrity pastor culture, or if we're slamming and trashing Randy. My my ego is fragile. My wife will tell you that. And it's really easy to get go down a bad, dark road really quickly and stay there. And I think that's why spiritual direction is something that I've discovered that I think is absolutely 100% essential for pastors and church leaders. Spiritual direction where you have a person who's most likely done what you've done before, and they've experienced all the things. They can resonate and relate to what you're talking about. And then you bring the good, bad, and ugly of yourself, not just your pastoral self, but yourself, and let it sit there, not in judgment, but in invitation and reflection, being able to dig deep into the reasons behind what's on the table that we just disclosed and showcased. That's such an essential practice for pastors and church leaders to have, because we need to have all of our stuff there on the table, being able to look through it and look for it. I will tell you, I've never been more in touch with my own brokenness than I have in the last year and a half since I've had a spiritual director. And that feels really healthy and good.
And for our listeners who want to hear more about this, check out our interview with that very spiritual director, Mark Werner, recently released.
What are your guys' reflections when you hear about or read about church cultures, and like that quote by Rachel Denhollander of the church being the least safest place in the world to reveal abuse or whatever? Elliot, you've worked now in a number of churches and been kind of pretty high up in a number of churches, and very different churches, right? Can you give us some hints and tips of what to look for in a toxic leader, perhaps, in a toxic leadership environment, in toxic church environment, because you've been in them?
Yeah. Yeah, I have. I think I started to become one, and that was actually when I made my exit, and I didn't realize how close I was at that point. But looking back, I'm so grateful that circumstances and maybe some wise counsel steered us around that. Because it's not that I was going to become a senior pastor or anything like that, but the mindsets where I started to realize that there was a large audience here, and I knew which buttons to push, literally in my roles as kind of creative and technical, but there's the emotional triggers, and if you can figure out the formula and you've got the platform and the people keep showing up because you can tickle what they're looking for and make them feel good about themselves, that creates this massive amount of power. And in exchange for that experience, people will offer their affection and appreciation, and that is just, it creates this high. And so within those organizations, there are those true pastors. Many of them probably won't have the pastor title. They'll just be kind of among the people. They are there, but the ones who are going to tend to rise to the tops are those that are going to be most effective at. I don't think manipulating is too strong a word for what goes on in those situations. You're creating an environment that's designed to elicit a response from people, which, in my experience, that looked a lot like big emotional praise and worship experiences where everybody in the room knows who actually gave them that experience and is really grateful to those people. Mm-hmm. That's jaded, and so I'm hesitant to even put that out there. I think what Scott expressed was probably a much more nuanced understanding with much more experience and seeing within the ranks of many more mega churches. But from my perspective, he was being incredibly generous to say that that's a viable structure.
I know there's some church leaders and pastors who listen to our podcast, and hopefully that number grows, and there's more than I think listening. But can I just speak to the church leaders and pastors real quick as we end our time together? I know the tendency that we have to idolize and put on a pedestal the leaders of the big churches, right? Whether that's the local leader who's just growing and we want to be like them, but we kind of hate them at the same time, or if that's used to be Mark Driscoll. Everyone wanted to be Mark Driscoll. We wanted to dress like Mark Driscoll. We wanted to preach like Mark Driscoll. We wanted the following of Mark Driscoll. We wanted to swear like Mark Driscoll. Then you had Matt Chandler or Rob Bell or, Bill Hybels, or fill in the blank. We've got these people that the church world is telling us to emulate and to model ourselves after, because that's how you find success. And I just want to say, pastor and church leader, I know where you're coming from. I feel your pain. But can we just look to Jesus? Can we just do that? Can we put the celebrity pastor to the side? Can we repent of modeling ourselves after a broken culture? And can we just return our gaze to Jesus and lead like Jesus and talk like Jesus and make decisions like Jesus and treat people like Jesus and watch what happens? I can't guarantee your church is going to grow exponentially and you're going to have 400 baptisms next year, but I can guarantee that you're going to change some lives, and you're going to have a church culture that's beautiful and good and you can be proud of, and it's going to affect you and change you and shape your family. If we just look to Jesus and put away the celebrity pastor, can we do that?
Now we should put some manipulative slow music behind him while he's talking.
Absolutely. Thanks for spending this time with us. We really hope that you're enjoying these conversations as much as we are. And if you are, help us get the word out. Before you close your podcast app, leave a rating or a review. That helps new listeners find us, maybe for the first time. If you'd like to share the episode you just heard with a friend or a family member, you can find those links on our social media pages. You can also find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/apastorandphilosopher. And that's going to work well for you, whether you're a kind enough person to financially support us out of the goodness of your heart, or if you're just looking for merch or the chance for a private tasting. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, this has been A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.